Legal practitioner Ajibola Dale takes us through the applicable regulations in the aviation industry and the limitations to passengers' rights and the airline's obligations to them. Tell us, what are the applicable laws guiding or regulating the aviation industry?
The most prominent is the Nigerian Civil Aviation Act, which was established in 2006. But you also have the other laws that establish the Federal Airports Authority. There's the act that establishes that. There's NIMET, the Nigerian Meteorological Establishment Act. There's also the act that establishes the Aviation College, the Institute, which regulates training for potential pilots. Going back to the Nigerian Civil Aviation Act, it was quite a robust act. Of course, in the wake of the several air crashes that occurred in 2005. But I think what was quite significant about that act is that it also incorporated all the international conventions. For instance, the Montreal Convention was domesticated. Also the convention to do with assets, aircraft assets and so on. So yes, it was quite an important feat. And it also established gave some kind of approval to the Accident Investigation Bureau, which of course is an important part of the whole process of ensuring regulation and safety.
Tell us about the Passengers Bill of Rights. Are you familiar with that?
Yes, the Consumer Protection Regulations was Regulation 19 of, I believe, 2012, Volume 2. And what it does, it's more or less incorporates what the rest of the world had done in terms of protection and providing a guide for passengers. In a sense, it also sort of took cognizance of the terms of the Montreal Convention. So what it does is it relates to situations where there's delay or denied boarding of passengers, or you know, where there's loss of baggage. It simply creates a set of simple rules. So there needs to be more enforcement from the point of view of the regulators. The NCA ought to sort of insist that these provisions are met by ensuring that the regulations, there's creation of awareness, not only from the point of view of the airlines, both local and international, but also from the point of view of the authorities or the committees set up to pursue this within the NCAA.
Has anyone come to you saying that their rights has been trampled upon and they want to sue an airline?
I mean, most of the work I do is actually to defend the airline. But because of my experience in there, a lot of people do come to me and say they do want to sue the airline. But, you know, I tend to inform them of the position of the law, that there are limitations, and that in order to surpass those limitations under the Montreal Convention, that certain steps ought to have been taken prior. Of course, a lot of the times people are not informed on what the position of the law is, and therefore often believe that they can just sue the airline for several excessive amounts. If a passenger comes to me and says, look, I want to sue for 100 million, and I say, look, in respect of baggage loss, there are limitations, and if you don't sort of meet the requirements to go beyond the limitation, then simply there's no point in going to court. There's no point in us wasting time. Or I have been involved in cases where passengers have complained about ill treatment. But I always say this to people: if you get into a taxi and you lose your bag, would you sue the taxi or the taxi company for $1 million because you lost your bag? And the answer is no. But the belief and the impression that most people have is that airlines have money, and therefore they have a right to sue the airline for large amounts, when in fact it was just a case of lost baggage.
Frequently, passengers in Nigeria complain of how domestic airlines especially delay their flights and say due to operational issues. This is something you're familiar with. I mean, how does this happen so often?
It was agreed in 1929 that airlines, having become commercial in the wake of the First War, it was decided that in order to have a uniform set of rules, in order to protect the industry, there would be things such as limitations. So there would be set rules as to compensation. So it was clear that, look, if you carry a bag or if you're going to be delayed, you know that you will only get, for instance, under the Montreal Convention, you're only entitled to 4,130 special drawing rights, for instance. You know for certain that unless you can prove that there was willful misconduct on the part of the airline, which is an excessive form of gross negligence, which is very hard to prove, by the way, if well interpreted. If you know that you can't prove these things, then if you're going to bring a claim for millions of dollars, then why don't you go by private jet? Even if you said, look, I lost a business meeting, how would you quantify that business meeting?
In terms of jurisdiction, what's the court for redress in Nigeria?
Is the Federal High Court. If you have a claim, Article 29 of the Montreal Convention simply states that any action, however founded for damages, whether in tort or what have you, must be brought within the confines of the convention. And in our constitution, the Federal High Court has jurisdiction in aviation-related matters. The Supreme Court has said this quite often. But of course, if you're suing the airline for a contract in respect of supply of books or supply of maybe transportation for its staff, then that certainly is not necessarily an aviation matter. So what you do is you look at the claim, the way it's couched, what the issue is that is brought, the cause of action, and based on that, then you determine what the jurisdiction, which court has jurisdiction.
The International Air Transport Association, IATA, projects that enhanced intra-Africa connectivity can indeed provide more jobs, more GDP growth for Nigeria. Is this something that you agree with?
When you talk about the need for creating a hub, Nigeria as a hub for sub-Saharan Africa, for instance, definitely the business is there, but the infrastructure has to be developed to the extent of creating that business. The airports have to be, and I think what government needs to do is, of course, we understand that there are sensitive aspects of perhaps privatizing or not, the idea of privatization against nationalization. But I think the way things are requires that government ought to consider very strongly the need to privatize the airports and the need to privatize a lot of the services within the airports. The idea that perhaps FAN has control over a lot of what's going on is not the best in my view. I think privatization creates competition and improves services. When you go to the airport and when you're receiving people at the airport who are coming into business in Nigeria, the airport is the first port of call for anybody coming in to invest or discuss business. And of course, the airport has to create an impression which will encourage that.
And that's the program this week. Please feel free to send in your comments. Also remember that you can watch this episode and past episodes of the program on our YouTube channel. I'm Millicent Walker. Many thanks for watching.